Welcome to this webinar on mental health in the workplace. My name is Susan Barker and I'm a Senior HR Consultant at Alchemist. The main purpose of this webinar is to provide you with greater confidence in handling the sometimes sensitive and complex issues of managing mental health in the workplace. During the presentation, please feel free to send your questions through, and we will be sure to answer them all by sending a Q&A document to you, along with a recording of this webinar in a follow-up email. So firstly, let's look at some statistics. There are a number of organisations who have carried out surveys in this field, and I'll give you some insights into their results. The Health and Safety Executive reported in 2017 that 526,000 workers had suffered from work-related stress, depression, or anxiety, and this equated to 12.5 million working days lost just for these reasons alone. The Mental Health Foundation conducted a survey too and received responses from nearly 5,000 people, of which 74% of them reported that they had felt so stressed or overwhelmed that they were unable to cope. And finally, the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development also produced a report in 2017 confirming that a staggering 11.4 million people in the UK were diagnosed with a mental health disorder. That is 1 in 4 people. So if we correlate the figures from the Health and Safety Executive with this figure, there is a very clear indicator that a large number of people are dealing with mental health issues whilst still continuing to work. This is known as presenteeism, and this should be as great a concern to employers as is the management of those workers who are absent from work. So, what is mental health? Over recent times, mental health issues have been much more widely covered in many aspects of the media and also by many charities in this field, who have all done some fantastic campaigns on raising awareness. The main theme of many of these campaigns focus on wordings such as, "It's okay to not be okay." And alongside of this coverage and these campaigns, most, if not all, soap operas have also covered many aspects and types of mental health illnesses. So in general, audiences far and wide have been reached out to. And this has helped to make some positive progress into eliminating the stigma which is often attached to mental health, but we still have a long way to go. There are many different types of mental health conditions, and these can affect people in many different ways. We shall explore some of these, perhaps more commonly known conditions shortly. A recent online survey carried out by YouGov revealed that depression and anxiety are the 2 most common mental health conditions in the UK. This result didn't come as a surprise to myself or to our team of HR consultants, as these are without doubt the 2 most common mental health conditions we find ourselves answering questions and queries on and giving advice on, along with stress, which is often diagnosed as being work-related. There are, however, many other forms of mental health conditions, and whilst I will explore in more detail the more common ones, employers should also be mindful and aware of the perhaps lesser known ones, some of examples of which are panic attacks, post-traumatic stress disorder, known as PTSD, bipolar, schizophrenia, obsessive-compulsive disorder, commonly known as OCD, psychosis, and suicidal thoughts and tendencies too. And these are just a few of a long list of mental health conditions. Many mental health conditions would be deemed to be a disability in relation to employment law, therefore making it all the more important for employers to deal with mental health issues in a fair manner and treated very seriously. So, what is a disability? In employment legislation, a disability is defined under the Equality Act 2010, and the definition is when somebody has a physical or mental impairment that has a substantial and long-term effect on a person's ability to carry out their normal day-to-day activities. But what does that actually mean? Well, the long-term element is benchmarked at a period of 12 months or more. Therefore, if somebody has had or is likely to have a medical condition for this period of time, then it is possible that they will be deemed as having a disability. However, the period of time is not the only marker to be aware of. The aspect of normal day-to-day activities is another benchmark. However, this aspect is perhaps much wider than one would expect from the words themselves. The day-to-day activities are not just about the workplace and job roles, although these must be considered in great detail too. Some examples of which could be things as simple as having a conversation, answering the phone, lifting heavy weights and objects, being able to work certain hours. And these are just a few examples of normal day-to-day work-related activities. However, the Equality Act looks further than just the workplace, and normal day-to-day activities can also include normal aspects of everyday life. Examples being getting washed and dressed, preparing and eating food and drinks, carrying out household tasks, walking, travelling on various means of transport, and even taking part in social activities. It would generally be down to a qualified medical person's opinion to define if somebody would be deemed as having a disability under the Equality Act. And this is why we often advise clients to seek occupational health assessments or a GP report. There are times, however, when the HR team here at Alchemus can help make a judgment as to whether someone or not would be protected under this Act. So, for example, some medical conditions would be obviously defined as having a disability. If you do have a health issue with an employee, speak to the HR team who can help talk through this matter with you in more detail and perhaps offer some guidance. Let's move on to the effects of mental health conditions now. Mental health issues are always associated with some kind of level of distress. However, what we should be mindful of is that whilst a situation might be of little or even no concern to one employee, it could cause another member of staff to experience distress and thereby cause or even exacerbate a mental health episode or a condition. And whilst there may be some very obvious signs of a mental health condition, along with absenteeism, of course, employers should be aware that not all symptoms are obvious and may even manifest themselves in different ways too. Many people are still struggling to be open about mental health conditions, as sadly there is still quite a lot of stigma attached to it. This means that many of your staff may be suffering in silence. You need to keep your eye out for this, and you need to treat this seriously. So what to keep an eye out for? Well, some examples could be if an employee is suddenly failing to meet the deadlines without there being any apparent work changes. Has their ability to concentrate on their tasks suddenly disappeared or wavered in any way? Are they late frequently when they were previously a good timekeeper? Do they show signs of being constantly tired or even exhausted? Frequent headaches, blurred vision can be other telltale signs. along with arguably some more serious indicators, such as irritable bowel syndrome, IBS, drug and alcohol use, abuse, and even things such as eating disorders can all be byproducts of a mental health condition. I mentioned earlier the three most common mental health conditions we come across on the advice line as being depression, anxiety, and stress. So let's look at these three areas in a bit more detail. Let's start with depression. There are different degrees of depression, ranging from mild to manic, and the range and severity of associated symptoms will be an indicator as to where a person would sit on this spectrum. The definition of depression is when somebody has a persistent sadness or low mood and a marked loss of interest or pleasure, along with a range of associated symptoms. The mental health charity Mind state the most common feelings someone suffering from depression will experience can include being down, upset, or more tearful than they would usually be, perhaps feeling restless and agitated, irritable, feeling guilty, worthless, and generally feeling down on themselves. And these feelings can lead to the behaviours we have already mentioned, such as having concentration issues, lack of motivation, and exhaustion, to name just a few. When diagnosing depression, GPs tend to look over at least a 2-week period in order to make a fair assessment. So this is often why an employee may go off sick on the first instance for a different reason. It could be stress, could be the irritable bowel, for example. And this may be before a full diagnosis of a depression then appears on any subsequent fit notes. If the fit note is for depression in the first instance, this could be an indicator that the person has had a previous history of mental health issues, and bearing in mind the 12-month period under the Equality Act, this is a point worthy of note. So let's move on to anxiety. The definition of which is the feeling of worry, nervousness, or unease. Often, anxiety problems occur when a reaction is out of proportion with what might usually be expected in certain situations. Again, reflecting to Mind, they suggest that the most common feelings of anxiety can range from a simple churning of the stomach to feeling lightheaded or dizzy, feeling restless, or even unable to sit still, along with things such as headaches, even backache and general aches and pains, all of which can ultimately lead to symptoms such as panic attacks, sweating, hot flushes, and even things such as insomnia. It is worth noting that a high level of anxiety over a long period of time can lead to other mental health conditions such as depression, OCD, and various phobias such as agoraphobia. Lastly, we look into the mental health condition of stress. This is probably the area we advise on the most on the advice lines in relation to mental health issues. And of course, it also crosses into the health and safety domain too, particularly under an employer's duty of care towards their staff. It is also arguably the condition which an employer has the most control over, particularly in terms of being able to support their staff. But we shall cover this aspect in more detail later in the webinar. Stress is the feeling of being under too much mental or emotional pressure when you feel unable to cope. And whilst a bit of stress in daily situations, both in and out of work, is normal and can often be a driver to some people, it is when there is too much stress for that person to cope with that it then becomes damaging. It can be hard to find the right balance, and it is worth remembering that with work-related stress, your employees may go on sick leave when they perceive that the demands placed upon them exceed their ability to cope. The healthcare organisation Simply Health conducted a recent survey on stress to ascertain what the main causes of stress are. And interestingly, out of the 16 reasons submitted, only 3 of these were non-work related. The main reasons that were cited were workload, management style and lack of support, pressure to meet targets and deadlines, long hours, and also job insecurities. The 3 non-work related reasons were relationships, finances, and health. And whilst these may not be work related, your business may still be affected by this, as they do cause issues such as performance and absenteeism too. We now know how some of the mental health conditions may affect anybody suffering from them, but how do they affect you as an employer? Research through Mind has shown that people with mental health issues isolate themselves from situations where they will have to talk about their mental health. And the results of the survey that they carried out show that 14% of those who took part in the survey had actually resigned from their employment as opposed to declaring they have a mental health condition. 21% had rung in sick. Both of these issues can be very costly to a business. Financially, absence can be costly to an employer, not only from a sick pay perspective, but also from any potential production downtime, for example, perhaps paying additional hours to existing staff to cover the workload, or even things such as paying a premium rate for agency staff to come in at short notice. This, of course, applies to any sickness absenteeism, but arguably there are potentially more things an employer can do to be proactive in supporting staff with mental health issues, and thereby perhaps preventing some of the absenteeism. We do tend to find on the advice lines that mental health conditions tend to result in long-term absence as opposed to short-term ones. And looking at the resignation figure of 14%, of course, any employee resigning from the business will have a detrimental impact from a financial perspective, but also from a management time one too. Recruitment and selection is very time consuming, as well as being costly. And in addition to that, you are perhaps still paying additional hours or agency premiums because you've nobody sat in that position, and this could be for weeks or even months. So let's start to focus now on how you as an employer can actually manage mental health issues in the workplace. Unfortunately, on the advice lines, we do come across situations quite frequently when an employee may appear to have jumped on the mental health bandwagon. And suddenly, a doctor's fit note is submitted for stress or anxiety, perhaps when they are being called to task, being brought for an investigation or a disciplinary matter, and this can cause frustration on many counts. It may be that there has been no indication of any history of mental health, no signs such as the ones we have previously touched upon, and therefore it may well be that the employer is then clouded with a view and perception that not every case is perhaps as genuine as it should be. It is worth noting, however, that an employer can still deal with employment and HR issues when an employee is absent, even due to mental health issues. And our HR team often guide our clients through this sometimes complex situations. If you do find this happening, then do speak to your HR consultant and we can assist. In general, however, most cases are genuine and we need to treat mental health issues seriously. We have to help and support employees. We have to do things to remove the stigma that is in the workplace. So where do we begin? Let's start by creating an open culture or building a new culture where it's okay to talk. Remember the campaigns we talked about earlier in the webinar. It's okay to not be okay. Get this message out to the staff. Make sure they know there is no shame in opening up to their managers, their directors, or their colleagues about mental health issues. Your managers can be trained on how to carry out things such as welfare and return to work interviews. Help them to spot the signs of mental health so that the company can then look in more detail at supporting employees. Granted, these meetings tend to occur during or after absences, but they can still be a good starting point to assure the employee that mental health is viewed as being as important as physical health by you as the employers. Regular supervisions and appraisals are a good way to also identify mental health issues. This is in particular when we're thinking about stress. There are risk assessments that you as an employer can carry out specifically for stress, and these too are a very worthwhile exercise. Not only will it help to identify potential risk areas, but it's also again another great way to demonstrate to your employees that you have a positive attitude to mental health under your duty of care. So if it is diagnosed and identified that an employee is suffering from a mental health condition, what else can you do? We've already touched upon encouraging an open mindset towards mental health, but you as an employer can also consider involving the professionals. Occupational health for assistance and guidance are great, and this is the more preferred route by our team of HR consultants here, as opposed to obtaining a GP report, purely because you tend to get a little bit more detail from occupational health. However, any medical assessment is beneficial and can certainly give a really good steer towards looking at if there are any adjustments that you can make in order to either assist the employee at work or perhaps to facilitate a return to work and any subsequent rehabilitation. As an employer, it is your duty to consider reasonable adjustments, and although each case will be judged on its own merits, it can be difficult to assess what this may be. So, for example, what may be a reasonable adjustment to one of our smaller clients may not be the same case for any other. Our HR advice team again can help with this assessment to look to see if any adjustments would be deemed to be reasonable. If they are reasonable, some examples could be, for example, allowing some time off for counselling appointments. It could be, if an employee is on medication, that they're a little bit drowsy. Therefore, allow them to start work a little later, perhaps. Allow them to arrive later in order that they don't have to perhaps go on busy public transport, which could be a particular problem for somebody, for example, suffering from anxiety. It could be that you adjust the targets or the deadlines. It could be that you even amend a job description. Remove some of the tasks that are causing particular stress or difficulties at that moment in time. Any of these adjustments can be made on a temporary or permanent basis. And remember, they may not all be feasible or even deemed to be reasonable. They will be judged on their own merits, but they're often worth considering. Finally, we look at some practical steps that you can take towards being a supportive employer. Firstly, some fairly simple steps, which in reality should be happening anyway, to ensure that you are compliant with the working time regulations. Encourage your employees to take their break times. Remember that you should allow, under the working time regulations, a minimum of 20 minutes in any 6 hours of work. But this is a minimum, and perhaps maybe not overly generous. So do ensure that your staff take a break away from their workstation. How many of your staff sit and eat their lunch at the desk, still staring at the screen? Encourage move away from the workplace. A breath of fresh air and a change of environment and scenery, even for just a very short period of time, has been proven to be beneficial to mental well-being. Don't allow long hours on a frequent basis. There will always be times when you need your staff to work beyond their contracted hours. There are deadlines to meet, there's a busy workload. But if this is happening on a regular basis, then you perhaps need to reassess the situation. Someone starting much earlier than their official start time or staying behind frequently should be reviewed under your own duty of care. Encourage employees to take their holiday entitlement. Whilst the majority of the population, I'm sure, love their holidays, there may well be those who don't look to book their full entitlement each year. Remember again, under working time regulations, the holiday entitlement is 5.6 weeks minimum. And whilst the onus is on your staff to book and take their holidays, a little encouragement from an employer can go a long way to ensuring that your staff are very well rested. So in general, look to support a good home work-life balance. It is important for your employees' mental well-being. Moving on to some other suggestions in mental health in the workplace, perhaps consider having a mental health policy in place. This can be a very strong message to anyone suffering from mental health, but also can give a very clear message in regards to you having zero tolerance of bullying or harassment from colleagues. This can go a very long way to helping to remove that stigma. They are also, again, a great way to promote and encourage the culture of openness, which is so badly needed in companies. Speak to your HR or your HS consultant if you would like more details or a sample mental health policy. Also look into stress risk assessments. These can be done alongside the employee, and they can be done as a proactive exercise, not just a reactive one when somebody has returned to work. They also can help you to look at the reasonable adjustments we've already touched upon. Again, we have a sample document for a stress risk assessment, but there are also a number of assessments that are available online. Whilst the adjustments I've already mentioned can be fairly low cost to the business, there are also steps you can take which could be more costly, but are also worthwhile. One example of this is something known as an Employee Assistance Programme, or an EAP. These are a great way of providing your employees support, and an EAP can be run with very little input from yourselves after the initial setup. EAPs provide a confidential helpline, which your employees can utilise. Some will provide a counselling session too, and they are a tool which are deemed by bodies such as employment tribunals has been an excellent benefit and support to your employees, and go a long way again to you meeting your duty of care. If you wish to explore this particular avenue in more detail, again, there are a number of EAPs available on the market, or if you speak with your HR consultant, some guidance could be given. I hope you found this webinar useful. Please keep an eye out for our follow-up email, which will have the recording of this webinar, along with some supporting material. And thank you very much for listening.